Okay, welcome everybody. So during this meeting, all participants will be in control of your own microphones. Please ensure that you turn your microphone on when you are speaking and remember to turn it off when you are finished. All reports published as part of the agenda will be considered as read by members of the panel. Published reports will therefore be summarised to allow the panel to focus on questions. Okay, apologies for absence. I've received apologies from Councillor Lakshan Saldin and Councillor Miranda Williams. Any more? Nope. Number 2, items of urgent business. I have none. Declarations of interest. Members to be asked if they have any declarations of interest other than those already listed. So I'm a council tenant. Councillor Thomas is council.
Sorry, yes,
Thank you, Chair. I'm an
you.
electrical contractor and I carry out EICR reports professionally, so related to item 5.
The mood's dropped. So, can members are requested to confirm as accurate record of the minutes that was held on the 9th of July 2024? Agreed? Okay, item 5, to consider the report on compliance and building safety update, which was submitted to the Cabinet on the 16th of October 2024, and make recommendations to the Executive if necessary. So that's Mr. Parkins, I believe. You're going to kick us off on item 5.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just say a few words. Good evening to you and colleagues. I will hand over very quickly to Richard, but I do just want to emphasise how important this work is. Like, there couldn't be anything more important to our tenants than around building safety, especially in the light of events over the last few years. And you will know, I think, members, that we self-reported to the regulator in May 22 for not being in full compliance in some areas of building safety legislation. And since then, officers like Richard have been meeting with the regulator. I hope you agree they've made tremendous progress. Still a few areas to attend to. We still also want to work on sustaining that good work, not just getting good and then sort of taking the foot off the pedal again. So Richard and his staff are also working on that. It went down well in Cabinet in the sense that people were pleased with the results and there was engaged debate. So I hope for the same tonight. Very much welcome your views on it and any recommendations you come up with. So I'll hand over to Richard to say a bit more detail. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Slattery, and thank you, Chair. So this report is quite important for 2 main reasons. The first one, the overriding one being, as Councillor Slattery said, it's about our residents' safety, it's about our tenants' safety, and the actions we are taking to make sure, firstly, they are safe, and secondly, that we are complying with the laws and the regulation as required, laid out in various statutes, etc. The second part as well is that there is a new consumer regulation regime from the Regulator of Social Housing. And one thing that the regulator is doing over the next 5 years is proactive inspections. At some point they will be coming to Greenwich and they will be doing an inspection of our housing services and they will be checking to see whether we're complying with the regulatory standards that they have laid out as what landlords have to comply with. And members may have seen recently the Newham judgment, which was one of the earlier judgments from the Regulator of Social Housing, where they got a C4 in their compliance, Consumer Standard 4. And if you read the judgment and the reason why they got that, they weren't complying with health and safety standards, and not only were they not complying with the health and safety standards, a sense of that members weren't aware of it, that the executive weren't aware of it, and they didn't have sufficient plans in place to make sure that they were moving towards being compliant with those standards. So what Greenwich really doesn't want to do is find itself in a similar situation, and all the work we've been doing over the past few years is to really address the lack of systems, processes and safeties we had in our buildings, but also the lack of assurance that members had around what we're doing, how we're keeping our residents safe, and the visibility all the way through from an officer level up through to the executives, Jamie and myself, a chief exec, but also on the members level from Councillor Slattery being briefed every couple of months, a report to Overview and Scrutiny, a report to Housing Strategy Board, and an annual report to Cabinet, so we can show that actually members have assurance and they have the ability to challenge, ask questions, see performance around, and take very seriously the work we do around health and safety in our blocks. And the report basically takes us through many of the things we've done over the last 2 years, the performance reports, the performance that we're at as of March this year. But the key thing about this report, it gives members the ability to see how we're doing, question how we're doing, and able to challenge the executive, the officers on where we could do better, what's going well, what's going badly, and ask questions on that, so we can prove that we have assurance around this. The report goes into detail on various things. There's some under 4.5, there is the KPI performance at the end of last financial year, so end of March, so March 2024. It also brings people's attention the fact that there's a new regulator as well, the Building Safety Regulator, which regulates our high-rise buildings. We have 67 high-rise buildings in our ownership, for which we have to do a building safety case for each one of those buildings. And effectively, a building safety case is a statement that says, we believe this building is safe, and then that statement has to be backed up by subcategories and backed up by evidence to show why you think that building is safe. So we believe this building is safe because all of the electrical EICRs are done, electrical installation condition reports, and here is the evidence to back that up. So we have to do 67 building safety cases for all those. We are actively submitting some to the regulator that they've requested as well. Also within the report, we have under section, give me a second, sorry. 4.22 is an update on damp and mould and the work we've been doing on damp and mould. Clearly there's been a national view on damp and mould over the last year or so in social housing, and it's part of the something the regulator has an eye on, and also something the Housing Ombudsman has an eye on, so there's an update on that as well. At that point, Chair, I'll pause. I don't intend to go through the report verbatim, so I'll pause there, and if there's any questions, I'm really quite happy to answer them.
Okay, so I have 3. So on the indicator list, I noticed that the EICR reports for communal and domestic council dwellings is a lot lower than all the rest. Also, unless I missed it, I did read the report, honestly. Are dry risers part of the test on the blocks? And also the other question was, just for me, is what's a tier 1 contractor? I was a bit confused what a tier 1 contractor was. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So our EICR performance, so electrical installation condition report, when we referred ourselves to the regulator of social housing, we had around 7,000 in-date domestic electrical installation condition reports, so significantly low numbers. Having an electrical installation condition report wasn't a statutory duty for social housing regulators. The duty was that you had a programme, a plan, and that you're acting towards that plan. We had neither the certificates or a plan of how we're acting towards it. So over the last 2 years, we've done a significant amount of work. And in the report, you can see that that had increased to 70, I think it was 71% of domestic EICRs. As at the end of last month, we had 93% of our dwellings at an in-date EICR. So once again, a significant increase. And it's an absolute testament to the team that they've been able to complete circa 12,000 electrical installation condition reports, and that's getting through around 12,000 front doors. Talking to people, an EICR can take around 2 or 3 hours, and being able to do that level of work over 18 months is incredibly significant, and a leading cause of fire is electrical safety and faulty electrical equipment. So being able to complete those EICRs has been a significant issue. So the latest update was 93% and continuing to increase. So we've got around only 2,000 properties left we need to get into. So it's significant improvement. With regards to dry risers, I think they are tested under our fire safety contract, so we do have some level of... I can't remember off the top of my head what the duty is around dry risers, but I'm fairly sure they are under our fire safety. We've got a fire safety testing contract that does dry risers, fire alarms, AOVs, automatic opening vents, all those kind of things, so I'm fairly sure they're tested under that. And a Tier 1 contract, there's some... They're named Tier 1 contracts. I'm not actually 100% sure of the... technical definition, but Tier 1 contracts are the big ones. So you've got people like Waits, Axis, United Living, Equans, the big contractors who generally will subcontract out a lot of their work. They've got some of their own in-house labour, but they'll also subcontract a lot of their work. And they're the almost household names you'll see as you're driving around any borough of people doing new build or doing refurbishment. So they're really sizable. There's probably to be fair, there's probably a financial figure linked to above X amount, but I'm not sure what that figure is.
Thank you. Any questions? Councillor Fahy?
Thank you so much for the report. I've got two questions, if I may. Relating to paragraph 4.25, I may have missed it, but I haven't seen any figures with regard to the number of properties involved in having mould issues. And you also talk about in 4.25 about the damp survey and the 11 working days. So presumably somebody comes along, does a survey. So what's the time scale between the survey being completed and the work being done? And the second point relates to the tenant survey. I note that only 71% responded, which is in some respects pretty high. But wondering what the other 29% are. And
4.35 tenant satisfaction measures. That's the first.
I refer to my brief. And the second point, thank you for that. And the other point is, I saw the survey, which is excellent, but surprised in view of the concerns expressed by tenants that only 26% responded to the question on complaints, and I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Fahy. With regards to damp, the actual work completed, it will depend on the work that he's doing for how long it takes, but we've invested about £1 million in damp and mould services over the last year. We've brought in a new team, we've had a new triage service in the contact centre, and we've designed new process and a new approach to damp and mould. And it's seen significant improvements for residents. Around 6 or 8 months ago, probably 12 months ago now, residents could have been waiting months, 3 months, 6 months for damp and mould to be addressed, damp and mould to be tackled, and obviously that was leaving residents at risk for a long period of time. What we now do is, if through the triage, if somebody is vulnerable, then the first thing that happens in both scenarios, but if somebody's vulnerable, somebody would there to wash off the mould, do a mould wash and address the problem within, generally within 3 working days. So the first thing we do is remove the risk, especially for vulnerable residents. And if they're not vulnerable, that figure's probably around, it depends on the month, it depends on how many queries we get that month, but it's around, I think, 10 working days, 10 to 15 working days. But we've absolutely got to focus on vulnerable residents, people with asthma, people with children, people with maybe breathing difficulties. So the first thing we do is we tackle the threat, we tackle the danger, which is the mould. Then a few days later, I think it's within 5 days, we have that survey done. We go around and we speak to the resident, find out if it's to do with a leak, find out if it's to do with broken windows, find out the reason that's causing the damp and mould and try and address those. And then the works, it might be significant work, so they could take a significant time. It might be simple work such as, I say simple, none of the works are simple, but installing extractor fans, which may take less time. So the length of the time on work could be variable. The key thing is that we're getting much earlier now, significantly earlier than we were in the past, to actually get rid of the danger, the threat, which is the mould. And that's significantly better than it was 12 months ago. On the tenant survey piece, I'm not quite sure whether 70, I believe you said 71%, it might be on that link. I think what we're seeing is actually really good response rates to our surveys, and actually if you look at benchmarking, which is starting to happen across London for tenant satisfaction measures, on many of the tenant satisfaction measures we are scoring above our peers and above other local authorities, and there are reports that I'm sure can be will be shared in future to look at those comparators across the piece. We had the borough-wide housing panel last week, or it was last week I think it was, and we actually showed tenants those numbers and how we're comparing, and we're actually comparing more favourably to many other authorities on our numbers. It's interesting, the complaints one, because that did come up as well, the satisfaction with complaints, but actually even at 26% we were scoring better than our peers, which is very surprising, but actually it's better than I think the average in London. So although it's low and although it's something we absolutely have to address and take on board, and that's the point of the tenant satisfaction measures now, tenants tell us what they think, we address it. Actually benchmarking across London on many of our tenant satisfaction measures, we're doing above average or better. So it's a good story.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Anning.
Thank you. This is a sort of outside the ballpark question, but we as councillors, I'm sure other councillors in the room, get inquiries often from tenants who have multiple issues in their flats: damp, leaks, windows, broken toilets, etc. They often describe to us the fact that they've tried for some years to get someone to listen, and they live busy lives, you know. I can think of one tenant I know who is a nurse and is also caring for a disabled person, a mother, in the same flat. So they give up, and then in desperation they contact the counsellor. So my question is, how does multiple problems all coexisting at the same time fit in to your model? It's easy to say we have a broken window in the bedroom and it's letting in the draft. But when you've got a broken window in the bedroom and you've got a leak in the shower and you've got toilet facilities that aren't working properly and something in the kitchen, is there a way in your models for a tenant or with the help of a counsellor to say, look, what we need is someone to come to this flat and do a checklist on all the things that need to be done, work out what's the absolute priority and get it fixed? Because for the tenant, it's extremely difficult to keep reporting one thing and then another thing and another thing. I am dealing with one case at the moment, and I've asked if it's possible for someone to do an overview of the flat. Now, it is in your model. Is there any way that a tenant or with the help of a counsellor can achieve that? Because it is complex for the tenant.
I know it's about compliance, but it's more of a repairs. But are you happy to answer that one, Richard? Yeah? That'd be good. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And luckily I look after repairs as well. So when you say in our model, there's a few different models. So we've just redesigned a model for damp and mould, whereby we've got a good triage up front, an incredibly good triage up front. We react to vulnerability really quickly. We get an inspection done quickly. Repairs take how long repairs take. There's a model where we've got responsive repairs where people call up, they say, I've got a broken toilet, we go round, we fix the toilet. There's different models. We're looking at in the future, probably going to be looking very soon, our approach to leaks. Leaks are a massive problem in our properties, and will be a lot of casework. It's a lot of our complaints casework where leaks happen. We think we fix them, they come back, and it can happen over years and years and years, and we need to figure out how we address it. Leaks from above where we can't get into the property above. So there'll be a different model for that. We do have a model where we have property service officers who at times where there's a significant issue will go into a property and look at all the issues in a property and say, okay, we need to do that, we need to raise that, we need to action that piece of work, that's a bit more capital investment, the kitchen might need changing. So there is that model. We don't have kind of hundreds of property service officers though. We have, I think at the moment, I think we've got 4 permanent posts, but I think 2 are vacant because they're a very difficult role to recruit to. Please don't quote me on that. That's just me remembering a conversation from a few weeks ago, but I think that's the model. So we do have that facility and that option, but we don't have massive resources specifically on that. But if there is casework and if there are difficulties like that, then by all means email myself or our head of service, and we can look into, or Councillor Slattery, we can look into getting a PSO, property service officer, around to look at the entirety of what's needed during the property.
Can I just add, I mean, I share Councillor Anning's thoughts on this, and we've discussed from time to time, because what you're talking about is a project management role, really, isn't it? And yeah, the nearest we've got is the PSOs, property services officers, and we haven't got enough of them, and obviously we're looking into that. And of course, below them, it's all organised by trade, so it is quite a complex thing. But absolutely, we can trigger that. And do come to me if you need it triggered, so to speak. Yeah, thanks.
Councillor Asgar.
Thank you, Chair. No, not mine. Not guilty. Thank you, Richard, for your talk. Got a few questions, so if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you the questions. It's probably easier if I just ask them all and then you can come back to me. Okay, so on the indicator table, the asbestos, number of high-risk asbestos actions for March 24, it says 0. Is that there are 0 requiring action or 0 have been actioned? Then under fire safety, all but one of the in-house fire risk assessor posts continue to be covered by agency resource supported by external capacity. So how many of these posts are there that are currently covered by agency staff, and what measures are we taking to recruit permanent in-house fire risk assessors? In a similar vein, in the action plan, one of the actions is recruitment. It says key posts have now all been filled with a permanent fire delivery manager. That's great news, but I would argue that fire risk assessors are actually key posts as well. So can we have a sort of indication of what the plan is with those? Then just on the number of high-risk buildings, RBG currently has 67, and then regarding the presenting the buildings, the safety cases, I know they will be called in as and when the BSR calls you, but it says we have a minimum of 7 high-risk buildings that are likely to be called in the first year. That would indicate that they have cladding on them, and I was under the impression that none of our stock did. So can you just clarify that for us, please? And then my final question is one of my favourite subjects, stock condition survey. Sorry, Pat. It says during the next 6 months, it says we need to understand our stock condition. It says discussing more detail above, but I can't see any relation to a stock condition survey earlier in the report unless I've missed it. It's 4.30. It says understanding our stock condition. And again, there's lots of capital works going on. Every time there's a programme that goes on, there has to be a survey that goes on. But if we had a current up-to-date stock condition survey, it could be pulled out and used when contractors need to tender or see it. So can we just have a bit of an explanation about a stock condition survey? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on asbestos actions, it was that there's 0 remaining, not that we've got 0 not been done. We had significant numbers when we first self-reported 2 years ago, but we worked all through them. So at the moment, there is no, our stock is all being surveyed, and we resurvey it as required in the management plans, but at the moment that's annually, and there's no high-risk actions that we have outstanding at the moment. So they're all completed. The key post being filled comment, I think, is really important. It's the understanding of who is responsible for what are many of our failings that happened when we reported ourselves 2 years ago, so what happened over the last 10 years, 15 years, is that there had not been named responsible people for certain elements of safety. And when we referred, and one of the key things was said, a few things went wrong, a few really high-level things went wrong. There was no governance. There wasn't strong enough governance, I think, would be more appropriate. No, not strong enough assurance across officers and members. We didn't have the right systems in place. And also, there wasn't the right people who knew that they had the responsibility for the role that they're meant to do. So our electrical safety manager at the time would have said, well, EICRs isn't my job, that's somebody else's job. And it's not, it was their job, but even if you looked at their job description, it wasn't really clear on what their job was. So we designed a new structure that had a head of service. There was clear instruction that is Sue Murray, so she was in charge of all of this, and we've got a key delivery manager for each of the big six. Asbestos delivery manager, fire delivery manager, water delivery manager, gas, the other two, I always forget, asbestos lifts, thank you. And they are the key posts that are being filled. Yes, fire risk assessors are an important post, and I'll come to that in a second, but they're not the person who makes us 100% on our fire risk assessment. They're not the person who makes sure that fire risk actions are completed. That is a fire delivery manager's job and a key post. And then that's Sue's job, and then that's my job. Fire risk assessors is a very interesting one. We for many years have not had a full complement of fire risk assessors. It's a very difficult market to recruit to. It's a very market that moves all the time. People need fire risk assessors, so they'll offer more money, and you lose your fire risk assessors. At the time of writing, we had a couple of fire risk assessors on agency and had them for a while. Right now, we've only got one fire risk assessor on agency because we've lost the others. Recruiting permanent fire risk assessors is incredibly difficult and probably puts you a bit of a risk in the market. So we're moving to a different model whereby our fire risk assessments are probably going to be outsourced to a professional company who will always have capacity to deliver them, but will have a permanent post as a clienting manager to client those fire risk assessments. So we'll always have somebody internally reviewing what the external fire risk assessors are saying, and what that stops is us just being beholden to agency staff, a market that fluctuates, somebody poaching our staff because they can pay money, and a real variability of fire risk assessors out there in the market. There is a real variability of the skill, quality, experience of fire risk assessors. It's a very, very difficult industry, and what the model does, it for us, it mitigates our risk, but yet we have an internal post that will that we're looking to client that to make sure it's run correctly. High risk buildings, yes, we believe we have. We know we've got 6 or 7 high-rise buildings, HRBs, that will be under the auspices of the Building Safety Regulator at the moment, because we're actually building some more, so more will come into stock, and we're purchasing more, so we'll have more than 67 in a few years' time. Some of our buildings do have cladding on them. They don't have ACM cladding on them. So you will see just up the road, you've got the high-rises here. They have cladding on them. They have HPL, high-pressure laminate cladding, and it's of a type that is deemed as suitable. They're currently suitable within the guidelines at the moment. There is a sense that in the future those guidelines might change, and we might have to take a view on what we're doing with those, with the cladding on those buildings, whether it needs to be replaced or not. There's a lot of work being done at the moment to assess that, and because they are high-rise buildings and because they have cladding on, we have already been called. They were the ones we expect to get called in on, and we've already been called in on a number of those buildings by the Building Safety Regulator, and they will have an opinion on that as well, on the safety of those buildings. So, you know, we can look out the window and see we've got cladding on buildings. It's whether it's dangerous cladding, it's whether it's flammable cladding, it's whether it's within the guidelines that are allowed or not. And there's a significant amount of work taking place with regards to that at the moment. And at the appropriate time, When we are very, very, very sure of our answers, we'll be reporting back to the Cabinet member, the leader, and probably overview and scrutiny and Cabinet on the outcome of that. Stock condition surveys is a very live issue. You may or may not know we had a major stock condition survey carried out about Savills in 2017, and that's what we based our current capital programme on. But as we've been, we designed a model whereby where we're doing works to validate our capital programme, at that time they will do a stock condition survey, and they'll also look for Cat 1 hazards under the HHSRS Housing Health and Safety rating system of that property. There's some work we still need to do, I think, on, as I referenced Newham earlier, and I've seen a lot of other judgments from the regulator of social housing. Many of them are mentioning stock condition surveys and organisations not having enough data on their stock. So there's some thought from those early judgments we've seen that actually we probably need to accelerate things in that area and start doing more and more frequent stock condition surveys for our stock. We thought we had a solution that worked. We probably need to review that and think about what we do going forward. But we have got stock condition data. We are capturing stock condition data as we go round. It's probably not going to be fast enough, and we'll need to do more.
Any more questions on this?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the report. All looks very good. Can I just ask a few more questions about a couple of the issues that were raised there? One of them being the mould and your action plan for dealing with mould now, which you've stated is using a mould wash within 3 working days or 11 working days. Is a mould wash actually deemed a suitable solution temporarily even in terms of, as you described, getting rid of the danger for vulnerable tenants? I from experience of having been in quite a few mouldy places, the mould has been there for a long time usually, and what residents say is that somebody comes in and just slaps a bit of mould wash on and leaves, and it doesn't really deal with the problem. But I note further down here that you say after 11 working days you'll be doing a damp survey, which is fine. That's hopefully going to get to the bottom of the problem. But then following that, what sort of timescale to the repairs that would be necessary once you've done the damp survey? And I'm just going to ask a couple further questions about the EICRs, just because I've got my eye on that. You've said that you now have approximately 93% in-date EICRs on domestic properties. Are all of those 93%, do they have a satisfactory outcome, or is it just a completed EICR? I also noted that, as I think Councillor Fletcher alluded to, that the communal EICRs in the same blocks were at a lower rate, or they certainly were in March. Has that improved any, and is that going to be brought up to the same level as the domestic ones in the same property? Because it needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yes, the mould wash is, from everything we understand, sufficient. The key point is that you remove the danger. The danger in damp and mould is the mould. That's what causes the spores. That's what can cause things like respiratory issues. So removing that quickly is really important. But then, as you said, equally important is getting around there to understand what the issue is. And generally, I think on average, we're doing that within around 5 days. So mould wash in 3 days, a couple of days later, surveyors around looking at what the problem is, raising repairs. And as I said to Councillor Fahey earlier, the repairs, it really just depends. If it needs to go into a capital programme, i.e. we need to put external wall insulation, that could be 6 months, it could be a year. If it's install extractor fan, it could be 20 days. If it's dry lining, trying to think of the word, I think I'll say dry lining, but put in kind of mold-proof paper up or board, so thank you, mold board up, then that could take 10 to 15 days. So it really just depends on the repair. But we have, as I said, we've invested about £1 million worth of resource in staffing alone into building this new team. which has the mould washers, the people who go around and wash the mould. It has managers, it has surveyors, and then we're spending more money on the contractors that we give the work to. We either do it in-house or we outsource this work to contractors, so they go around. So we are constantly reviewing on how quickly we do things. We've got performance reporting that gets reported up to Jamie Carswell as a director every quarter to see how we're doing. And some months is great, some months, because we get many reports, and especially we expect over the winter months we're going to see much higher reports of damp and mould. You know, that those days could slip slightly, but it is a much improved service on what it was a year ago. So the answer being it all depends on which repair it is. EICRs, yes, you can tell you do EICRs, 93% are satisfactory. We do not count them if they're not satisfactory. So when I say it's 93%, it means satisfactory. So we don't count them unless they're satisfactory. So we will have done more than I said 18,000, 12,000. We would have done more. We would have done one if it was unsatisfactory. As you know, we fix a problem, then we do it again. So all of those are satisfactory EICRs. And for communal, yes, real focus. When the contracts were written for the communal EICRs, it probably done through a lack of understanding of really what was needed in one, and it was priced a bit. It wasn't priced as well as it could have been. So frankly, the contracts, we had the electrical contractors didn't want to touch it because they weren't making any money out of it. And these things always happen operationally. You always have these situations you have to deal with. We've done a lot of work with them over the past year or so, and now communals, as of the last update, was at 85% of our blocks. So a significant increase, and that's going to continue on. And the key thing is that all of our blocks have been surveyed, all of our blocks have had an EICR, but 15% of them aren't satisfactory. So there's work that needs doing, then we'll redo the EICR, then they'll be satisfactory. We've done 100%, yep, but we only count it if it's satisfactory. So every one of our blocks, we know what the problem is. We need to do works on 15% to make sure they're satisfactory EICRs. On the communal ones, yeah. Yes, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Thomas?
Sorry, I've just got a really quick one. If I can just circle back quickly to asbestos. I just thought about a case that I had a few months ago where a tenant had a bit of her ceiling removed, and it went on for quite a few weeks, and she got in touch with me quite distressed in the end because she didn't know what was going on. It turned out everything was fine and it wasn't a big deal. But I'm just wondering what the process is as regards to getting back to the tenant and letting them know what's going on. And the other thing about that case was that there was nothing that kicked in after it was determined that there was no asbestos there that ensured that her ceiling was made good. So I had to then get involved in that, in getting someone to come out and plaster it, and then get involved again for somebody to come out and decorate it. It didn't feel very joined up to me, so just wondering if we've got any processes in place for something like that. Thank you.
So that would come under the general repairs process, and we've got a lot of work in our transformation programme for that. We've done a lot of work around normal repairs, but non-health and safety element repairs on plumbing and on carpentry, etc., where we set up a follow-on line whereby if somebody's got some work, some follow-on works they need doing, the trade staff member will call the follow-on line, they'll get an appointment there and then, they'll hand that to the resident, so the resident really knows what's happening. So we're doing a lot of work across the repair service about making sure that, back to when we did a diagnostic of our repair service 2 years ago, this phrase that keeps coming back and we keep using because it's quite a good phrase, is that tenants felt they were project managing their own repairs, and we said that can't be the case, and we've done a lot of work and can prove and show a lot of work. There's still situations where we do fall down and we do make errors in the service, and where we still need improvements, and that's an example. The asbestos in the report is regarding our asbestos surveying we do. So of our communal areas, we have to complete initially a survey to see is there asbestos there. If there is asbestos, we have to do a resurvey. Generally, we do it annually, but you could have a management plan say it's done every 2 years or every 3 years, depending on the height, the risk level of that asbestos. Separate to that, if we go into a domestic dwelling and we think there might be asbestos, the trade staff member will request an asbestos survey. That then has to go off to a specialist company that we've got. We've got 2 contractors who do that for us at the moment. They'll come round, they'll do a sample test, they'll check whether there's asbestos. If there's not asbestos, then the work should carry on as normal. Now, you can see in that whole process how something falls down at some point, and we haven't yet fixed and got better at saying, well, once that's done, who picks up the report, who actions, what happens next, what happens next, what happens next. And I've sat here on the repairs side of things and said, we've got a lot better than we were, but we're still not perfect, and sometimes things do fall down. So for me, that's issue isn't a health and safety asbestos issue, that's a repairs issue, that still our process isn't working as well as it should be. And by all means, in any of those situations, just kind of email us or whatever, and we'll try and put that forward. But you can see where we're having to go and test for asbestos. Somebody gets a report, that report lands in somebody's inbox, they're on leave, and then you can see how, and we just got to get process in place that get better at those things.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, thanks, Richard. Very interesting. You can stay if you want for the rest of the meeting, or... Okay. If you want to come sit up the front, Sean. No. Okay, thanks. So item 6 is homelessness and at-risk residents. So to consider a report on homelessness and at-risk residents and make recommendations to the executive if necessary. So I'll hand over to you first. Councillor
Yeah,
Slattery.
just briefly to introduce this is Sean Fluck. People will know him. This is another area, obviously, of super importance and interest, I know, to members, and I'm getting more casework about this now, frankly, than repairs, which is quite a turnaround. And people will know the situation in London and perhaps in other cities as well about the private sector landlords pulling out, so the supply is dwindling, so many more people coming to our front door, the Woolwich Centre, whom we need to help. And as a consequence, we've got more people in temporary accommodation and hotels, which is no good for them and no good for our coffers. You'll see, I hope, and perhaps Sean will draw attention to the fact that hotel use has gone down significantly since April 24, when I think it was 291 at its highest, and as of maybe last week, Sean, you'll correct me, it's down to about 167. But still a long way to go. So we've done a lot on it and welcome your sort of feedback on that. I would say as well, obviously it's tempting this time of year, given the weather, to talk a lot about rough sleepers, which we will answer any questions you've got, Chair, but because that's the most visible and acute form of homelessness. But we've sort of, this panel has deep dived into rough sleepers. So very happy to take those questions, but it's also about the less visible homelessness that Sean is responsible for telling you about as well. Cheers.
Thanks ever so much, Pat. Thank you, Chair. Thanks, panel. So, in fact, the area of homelessness is so big that there are 2 reports about the matter. The first report I will focus on what we are doing to prevent homelessness in the first place from happening, and talk about the scale of homelessness and demand. Then the second report will really focus on temporary accommodation. So there are 2 separate reports. Obviously, we'll do one at a time.
Sorry, I just fit them both together. Forgive me, Chair.
No, well,
They fit.
It was a good summary, Pat. Thank you. So the first one is about homelessness and at risk of homelessness. I'm going to talk about the current situation, the challenges we are facing, which are not just Greenwich, but are national, and what we're doing about it. What's our systematic approach to trying to prevent homelessness? So I won't go through the whole report. The panel will have seen the report and read the report. I very much look forward to the questions, but I'll summarise some of the key points from the report, I guess. The starting point being that we are literally and figuratively in a homelessness crisis at the moment. Homelessness is at the highest levels it has ever been nationally since homeless legislation was incepted in the 1970s. There are 117,000 households living in temporary accommodations. That's statutory homelessness, statutory number of people living in temporary accommodation. Then there are an almost immeasurable number of people at risk of homelessness or living in insecure arrangements. And I think you probably don't need for me to go into any detail about why that might be the case. What we'll try and focus in on is the drivers, the key drivers of homelessness in this borough as much as we can. When we come to TA, we might talk about things in a slightly wider way. So the drivers at 4.3, and I don't have page numbers on my version, but at 4.3, we talk about the drivers or the reasons. Thank you, Pat. This pie chart at 4.3, called the drivers of homelessness, is essentially capturing data that we supply to the government through a quarterly return called the H-Click return. So every local authority in the country supplies data, of course, about homelessness to the government, and the government asks you to codify things in certain ways. So we are asked to decide why this person in front of us is homeless. What is the reason for their loss of their last settled accommodation? So we're limited to choosing one reason for homelessness, and we're limited to the reasons that are in the government return. And it's quite interesting when you look at this that there are lots of reasons which can become very much conflated. Somebody can be suffering domestic abuse, can be getting evicted from private rented sector tenancy. So they could really have two reasons for homelessness, and we have to choose one of them. And that's a key point, is that our homeless clients these days are facing multiple disadvantage and have multiple vulnerabilities and support needs. But the main reasons, which are helpfully laid out in legislation to be fair, over this time period, which was the financial year 23-24, the main reason for homelessness applications to this borough was loss of private rented sector accommodation, which probably won't come as a surprise to the panel. It's always been one of the highest reasons for homelessness, simply because the private rented sector, although it provides a deal of security, it is also less secure than owning your own home, for example, or living in social housing. And so there's a certain amount of turnover in the private rented sector, but that has massively increased in recent years due to the affordability crisis. Rents have been shooting up, and actually the supply of private rented sector housing coming onto the market that people can afford has shrunk to almost non-existent levels. So that's the main driver of homelessness at the moment. The second one last year was families no longer willing or able to accommodate. So that is where people grow up in their family homes and their family can no longer keep them for a whole range of reasons, which are probably going to come out in the rest of the report, such as the financial resilience of their parents, for example, not being able to sustain themselves and their children as they grow up and grow, their families grow. And obviously overcrowding is a main driver of homelessness from the familial home. Reason 3, domestic abuse, sadly. I don't need to probably tell the panel why domestic abuse causes homelessness. It is very sadly increasing, probably increasing more than any of the other reasons at the moment. In fact, private rented sector is actually dipping slightly this year. This data was from last year. Private rented sector evictions have gone down this year. Unfortunately, the number of people becoming homeless due to domestic abuse is still increasing. And in actual fact, it might be the number one reason now, domestic abuse, having looked at some data earlier today. Number 4 is friends no longer willing or able to accommodate. So that is the colloquialism of the sofa surfer, somebody living in someone else's home, being turfed out by that person. They can no longer look after them. But actually the homelessness in cases of that probably comes... Sorry? Did someone else say something?
No, I think someone coughed.
Oh, sorry. Beg my pardon. Okay. So I'll try and speed up a bit because I'm probably going into too much detail, which is quite a common issue. So just to sum up the next section, which is data, there's an awful lot of data we can use to benchmark ourselves against other London boroughs, against other local authorities across the entire country, of course. Obviously, we compare ourselves most commonly to London boroughs. And to sum up the data, when it comes to measuring prevention, are we any good at preventing homelessness? We are in the top third of boroughs at preventing homelessness. And that's what the data, it tells me anyway, and hopefully it tells you. But I'll take questions about it. So what are the challenges in curbing homelessness and prevention? So again, I won't read out the entire report, but there's some really interesting data in here because this is a homelessness crisis. Something must be going on, something must have changed. So I think as an example, we're seeing quite a large number of people who have come to this nation seeking refuge, seeking asylum. They were put into hotels by the government as contingency, sort of temporary accommodation, pending their decision. And then when their decision is a favourable one, a positive one, then of course they are homeless. They have no home in this country and they have to apply to a local authority as homeless. And there's been a very large increase in that over recent years. We're very happy to help. We're a borough sanctuary, but of course it is additional demand. So that's one of the reasons, and that's not just Greenwich, that's a national part of the reason why we're in a homelessness crisis. I think the third sort of circle there, which says 41.9%, 42% of homeless households in England have one or more support needs. So I think the point there being homelessness isn't just about losing your home, it's about the fact that you tend to be vulnerable for one of a range of reasons. And where it says one or more support needs, very common for homeless people. I'm not only talking about single people here at all, I'm talking about parents, I'm talking about families. The children in those families have multiple support needs very commonly. And that, if you're able to look back and compare that to previous years, that will have risen a lot in recent times, in the last decade or 15 years. So that sets out some of the obstacles to people finding their own housing. The lack of genuinely affordable properties is something that inhibits people finding their own housing instead of having to apply to local authority as homeless. And the lack of genuinely affordable properties is kind of a triple whammy for homelessness. So there's people in insecure housing who cannot afford to rent or buy a secure home in the private rent sector. The councils can't work with landlords to obtain their properties to use to house people in the private rented sector to prevent homelessness. And evictions, of course, soared because landlords are chasing, in some cases, more money. The next two items are about affordability, cost of living crisis, lack of financial resilience. That will all be fairly self-explanatory. There is the point about multiple complex support needs made in a little bit more detail at the bottom of that page. Then we talk about overcrowding, which I've already mentioned. There's been a relative reduction in availability of affordable housing supply in the last 5 to 10 years, very significant reduction. We used to be able to allocate 2,000 council homes a year. It's now 1,000 a year, which is going up actually because of Greenwich builds. And that's a nationwide issue. There's just less council housing available, less social housing available, less voids, etc. Therefore, people are less able to be rehoused from housing registers, much more likely to become homeless instead, because they've got no other options. And then I've talked about working with refugees and asylum seekers. So the next section is where we start to talk about the systematic approach to preventing homelessness. I won't talk about housing support finder, but it's what we're saying there is we are working very hard to make sure that homeless people or people at risk of homelessness have the best information possible about the different housing options. Even though the private rent sector might have dried up, it's still there. And we need to make sure people who want to move to private rent sector really can. We do lots of work because it's a main cause of homelessness to help residents stay with friends and family. I won't go into the detail. We do an enormous amount of work helping residents who have a private rented sector tenancy to maintain it and not to lose it and become homeless. And we do a lot of work to help homeless households have the option of moving into private rented sector if that's what they want to do. Although much of that work is harder today than it's probably ever been. I've worked in homelessness since 1996, and it genuinely is harder than it's ever been. 4 is, of course, we help residents find social housing. One of the key points in there is that some of our homeless households want to live elsewhere, not in the borough of Greenwich. And we can help people, and we do help people find social housing, actually permanent social housing elsewhere in the country. Not in huge numbers, but we do have arrangements to do that. So it is an option. And point 5 is a really important one, which I think is something we're really starting to get deeply into on the back of the anti-poverty strategy and lots of other strategic work going on across the council. We know we need to work in closer collaborations with other services. Homelessness needs to be a priority for more services than maybe it is at the moment. It's not surprising we're in a position where we are at the moment on the back of 10 to 15 years of quite large reductions in funding for local authorities. So we need to come together with the resources we have to maximise what we've got to prevent homelessness, and we're really starting to get into that. But it's a long way to go, and that's not meant as a criticism. So section 5 is about consultation engagement. We do do a lot of consultation engagement, of course, with our homeless communities, which is set out in the paper. Of course, we do a lot of consultation engagement with the partners and stakeholders we work with, knowing that the only solution is to work in collaboration, to work in partnership, and to dream up new ways of helping people avoid homelessness and come out of homelessness. And my last point, really, is that when we're talking about prevention, I think in the midst of the most severe homelessness crisis the country has been in since the homeless legislation was incepted, and the TA crisis that's come from that, we've had, as a sector, to really focus on the TA budget crisis side of things. I'm talking about Greenwich and every other London borough, and it has meant we've had very little time and resource to devote to prevention, which is completely the wrong way around. You want to be devoting as much time, resource, energy on prevention, but the system and the nature of the situation has actually pushed us in the wrong direction. We're really working very hard to maintain that focus on prevention, on housing options, and on helping people avoid homelessness, but we've a way to go. We have been subsumed, as you'll hear much more about in paper 2, on our own temporary accommodation budgetary crisis. That's my last point, and I very, very much welcome questions.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for the report. I was just going to ask, it seems to me there seems to be more homeless men than women. I don't know if that's a fact or whether that's just because I've been approached by loads of homeless men looking for accommodation. And interesting, you was talking about other boroughs. I was going to say, because of the extent of homelessness, are us and other councils looking at pooling resources and perhaps working, rather than working as 24 separate boroughs, working as a London borough and all working together, because some boroughs might have some accommodation that we don't for homelessness. And the interesting thing was, you was talking about the private sector. I know in Dartford, they're helping residents who are in arrears in the private sector. So I don't know if that's something that we're looking at, but I thought it was a pretty good idea. And they're helping some of their residents, obviously, to work out their finances so they don't get, as you were saying earlier, Sean, so they don't get evicted from the private landlords. I was just wondering whether that was something, I know we do some stuff with private landlords, but I was wondering whether that was something that we might possibly be able to look at as well. I mean, obviously not hundreds of thousands, but, you know, just small amounts.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I'll take them in the order in which you raised them, if that's okay. So I think single homelessness, as a matter of fact, yes, men do tend to be more represented by being homeless, and that would be due to a whole complex set of reasons. So men tend to, I don't know, be engaged in more risky behaviours, more likely to be suffering or have substance misuse concerns, might be more involved in certain activities which are more likely to lead you to being in insecure housing, and also there's a whole range of it. So this is a tricky one. It's quite common when a relationship ends that it might be the man that has to leave the property or does leave the property, for example. Men are potentially more likely to be involved in being violent and abusive to other people. So although in domestic abuse, unfortunately, very many women are rendered homeless due to domestic abuse, obviously very many men end up potentially in prison and end up then being released from prison and end up homeless as a result of that. So there's a whole range of factors related to gender. I'm probably not a world expert on it, if you see what I mean. But so what it does mean, though, is that our services need to be geared up for exactly that. So we do see more male rough sleepers on our streets, and they tend to have very, very complex needs indeed, and that can include sometimes quite challenging behaviour. So our outreach staff and our other staff working with rough sleepers have to be able to work with men in that kind of situation. And it's also quite interesting if you look at things like domestic abuse. the systems, the funding and everything is absolutely rightly very heavily weighted in the favour of helping the survivor, the female victim, but there's not an awful lot in the way of schemes that address perpetration, for example. So by which I mean to say in this context, once a man gets into that kind of cycle, that kind of spiral, sometimes there aren't necessarily services there to help them get out of that cycle, and they end up remaining chaotic, remaining challenging, and remaining unattractive to private sector landlords and so on.
Can I just come in just to say, Councillor Fletcher, that I'm sure there's research on gender and homelessness, so we'll dig out something and send it to you if that's all right, for a bit more detail, because it's an interesting point, isn't it? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. On the working with other boroughs, there is a lot of that goes on. I'm quite pleased to be able to say. So, for example, my director, Jamie Carswell, is the joint chair of the London Council's Housing Directors Group. So every single borough has a housing director, and he chairs a meeting, and it's not just a meeting, it's a partnership of all of those directors, and they talk about homelessness obviously a lot. So that means there's an awful lot of opportunity at a very high level to work together, make sure that we're using best practice from all over London and representing London's needs, because homelessness in London is far more acute than it is in the rest of the country. That's always been the case. There's a heads of housing needs and homelessness group, which our head of housing inclusion and support services attends. That's convened by London councils again. That is all about sharing information, sharing best practice, and then going off and talking to your peers in other boroughs about what they're doing. And it's also about launching joint bids for funding. There's often opportunities to obtain funding from the government, GLA, London councils even, around sub-regional working homelessness. We're in the South East London Housing Partnership, and we do a lot of work with our neighbouring boroughs, of course. And the MHCLG have specialist advisors on homelessness, and part of their role is to make sure other authorities are learning from other authorities about what's best on homelessness. But I suppose the most important thing is about those joint funding bids. If we were focusing on rough sleeping, then I'd be able to tell you about the millions of pounds Greenwich has been able to secure from various bids made to the government, GLA, etc., many of which are joint bids with other boroughs, and that's certainly the case. So there's a lot of joint working with boroughs. In terms of sharing accommodation, yes, if there's been a joint bid for accommodation, this borough here might host this building here, but these boroughs here might all use that building, and there's a fair number of examples of that.
Can I just come in as well? Because I think when you said pooling resources, Councillor Fletcher, I don't know whether you mean kind of homes themselves. You can imagine that Lewisham, Brent, Southwark, Islington are not keen to offer us up any homes. I've occasionally had some cases where others might have done as well about families who simply cannot stay in the borough for different reasons, gang-related, DV, all the rest of it. We try and do reciprocal arrangements, don't we? I don't know how frequent that is, actually. I mean, we've been trying for over a year to accommodate a family outside of the borough, but they need a 4-bed and a wheelchair accessible. I've made contact with my counterparts, the leader's made contact with his counterparts, and we'll do a sort of switch, but I don't think it's got anywhere. Wherever you are, you'll come up against that shortage of supply. Yeah.
Thank you, Pat. And in regards, Chair, your final question about private rented sector prevention. So, again, no page numbers, regrettably, but point 3 on, I don't know which page, which is headed Help Residents Maintain or Find Private Rented Homes. So that does set out and in some detail the work we do. So we do spend to save where it's appropriate and the right thing to do. So I would call it a homelessness prevention fund, for example, which is where there is a tenant due to be evicted by their private rented sector landlord. They might have had a financial crisis, and that's the reason they're in arrears, and they're now a good payer. But they do owe quite a bit of money in arrears from that time when they couldn't pay properly. Then we might be able to say, okay, if you pay half of that debt that you owe landlord, we'll pay the other half, as long as you carry on then paying your rent after that point. And the landlord can either agree with that or not. We do that. And then we also obviously make sure we take advantage of discretionary housing payments, which is essentially a housing benefit top-up. So if there's a shortfall between the housing benefit and the rent the landlord wants to receive, that the tenant cannot make up, then sometimes we can pay that gap using discretionary housing payments. So I suppose the short answer is that we most definitely do this, and we're quite good at it. I would say this is something we're strong at, working in the private rent sector, because it is the biggest cause of homelessness in the borough. So hopefully Section 3 will give you some assurance that that is the case. We're very happy to take questions or observations after the panel has finished as well.
To the panel, any questions? So we've got 3, so we'll do it in order then. John, Magella, Sandra, and then Naz, yeah?
Thanks very much, and these are 2 very depressing reports by any stretch, and even more so as winter settles in, really, so it's going to be challenging. But I think it's important for us as members to thank Sean and the team for all the work they do, really, and the casework that they respond to in very difficult circumstances, so thank you for that. Before I move to the comments I wanted to make, is it possible in terms of rough sleepers that members could have a short piece of paper that when they see rough sleepers, they can give them the piece of paper which confirms what they can do themselves? From time to time last year, I talked to a number of rough sleepers on the street, and then I rang the department and they followed up, but they'd left. So I just think if we could do more, that would be extremely helpful. And I know you're very busy and all of that. I think we're between a rock and a hard place, I think, in terms of the challenges that we're facing. And it seems to me that in terms of the housing stock, I very much hope, and I'm not quite sure we're at the stage yet, whereby government's views are coming through slowly, and there are consultations taking place about how we can develop a better offer in terms of local authorities building accommodation and all of that. But at this point of time, we are where we are. And the question I want to ask really is that if we recognize that we have major problems, as we have, in terms of getting people access in the borough who are legitimately able to fulfill the obligations of their right to do so, why we don't have a more collective approach, which is simply housing are taking all the stick, really, in terms of we haven't got enough homes and all of that. We need to build more homes. Yet we have a situation where a couple of weeks ago, I calculated up we were going to build 1,500 one-bed flats for students. Now, in actual fact, if you look at the numbers here this evening, we've got more families needing accommodation than student accommodation. And then you have the other problem whereby the housing associations, in my view, have lost the plot. Well, I don't think they've lost the plot. Their forefathers will be turning in their graves because they're building properties for sale, and the potential number of properties being allocated to social housing is wholly inappropriate in terms of numbers. So I just think that there needs to be some dialogue about how we resolve this. And then we have the ultimate sin, whereby some of these companies are advertising in Singapore about buy-to-let. And therefore, every property built by the private sector going elsewhere is not helping our needs. So is there a potential of bringing all the housing developers together, whether it be housing associations or the local authority or the private sector, and saying, well, hi guys, this is where we are, this is what we want. How can you collectively help to help us reduce this particular situation? And if I go to a planning committee ever again, which I'm trying to avoid, and hear somebody giving us a lecture about viability assessment, I'll just crack up and end up in a private home. Because I just fail to understand the profit margin of the private sector is about 8%. And the fact that they reduce their number of social properties to about 10%. And that's lucky if we get that. Then I think that's a challenge. So forgive me for that rant. And the other point I wanted to raise is with regard to the families in hotels. You talked about currently 99 families in hotels with 184 children, with 99 families. What's the breakdown in terms of the families, asylum seekers versus others in housing need? That would be helpful. And you talk about the number of children, 184 children. It would seem to me that the problems, not only that the families have, being homeless, trying to get their children to Greenwich, to schools, and then having to work as well, seems to be astonishing. So it would be useful to have a view as to how all this comes together. And the final point I wanted to make, you talk about having no households in hotels by March 2026. I think it's great if you do, but I think it's wholly ambitious. And if that's your objective, how do you propose to get there? Thank you.
Sorry, Chair, if I may, I'll just take, because some of that's outside of Sean's purview, as you can imagine, and indeed outside of mine, in terms of levers we've got over the housing sector. And obviously that's pretty much national government, and we're all hopeful that they'll give us a few more levers. I've certainly been in many meetings, and you all have, where viability is thrown up, and it's very difficult to argue, and we get independent economic viability people. This, by the way, is the regeneration and planning portfolio, so I'm not going to say much more because I'll start getting it wrong. What I do know about housing associations is that they are definitely building fewer homes, partly because they need to use their money to improve existing homes because of the higher building safety regulations. So that's quite a feature in the market, actually, that they're sadly building fewer. And for some reason, student accommodation is more attractive to developers, and I was told why, and I can't remember. But, I mean, there's a planning application in that I'm objecting to in my own ward just now, which is to increase student accommodation in what was otherwise a family home.
It's more lucrative.
Eh?
It's more lucrative. It's the new cash cow for developers. That's why. It's money.
It must be. And there's so much of it. But I think, to be fair, those are beyond this fellow's. But I appreciate the rant and agree with pretty much every word of it. But Sean will be able to answer, I think, the handout thing to rough sleepers and also about hotels, getting out of hotels.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Pat. So on rough sleepers, yes, we will produce something for members. If we haven't already got it, I'll speak to my rough sleeping coordinator first thing in the morning, see what we've already got. If we haven't got something, we'll have something by the end of tomorrow. On the families and hotels, that is pertinent to the second report that I'm going to come to in a minute. I can answer the question now, Councillor.
I was, that's for sure, John. That's my fault.
I can answer. If I answer it now, I might as well. Yeah. So, of the 99 families in hotels on the 30th of September, you asked how many are asylum seekers, how many are not, and so on. So, those 99 families, none of them are or would be or can be current asylum seekers, because we cannot accommodate in temporary accommodation asylum seekers. It's illegal to do so. They're pretty much the only category of person who are not entitled to Homelessness Act assistance because they are ineligible under law. Now, some of the 99 families in hotels probably are former asylum seekers. So they may well have arrived in this nation seeking refuge from a homeland they've had to flee for various reasons. Then they've got a positive decision which gives them the right to remain here, and then they can apply as homeless, and they would be in our hotels. So I don't know the answer off the cuff. Of the 99, how many are former asylum seekers? There will be some. There will most definitely be some. And he did, of course, mention about how incredibly difficult it is to live in hotels outside of the borough. And I think maybe that part we'll come back to in report 2, if that's okay.
The other bit was how we intend to get to no hotel use by March 26th.
Yeah.
May.
If that's okay, if we come to that one in part 2 as well, I think that's probably because that's part of the, a really core part of that report.
Councillor Allen?
Thank you, Chair. In terms of prevention in this report, I was interested in a couple of aspects, but first of all, what effect have you noticed, if any, from the early release of prisoners in the recent schemes in the borough? In terms of prevention, I'm not sure what happens before a prisoner is released. Does the local borough have any access to the prison, and any information for the prisoners? Or is it, in terms of prevention, perhaps it should be considered that a housing officer should have some sort of role there as a preventative thing, because we have heard of stories now of prisoners being released early with very little notice, and they really have nowhere to live. And that's primarily single men. I'm sure there are single women as well, but I think single men are the main element of that. And my second question is about the prime and beam schemes. And I note that, while the numbers who have been helped is small, that there is a certain cost per family or per individual. If you could tell me just what the council does in terms of help, presumably it's to find, a deposit for a flat or something like that. And would it be useful for that element to gain more funding? Because that is a key preventative measure. And has there been any moves for the funding mix from grants from government or wherever you can find them to be funneled into that area? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Anning. So in terms of the early release scheme or programme that has happened recently, a very small number of people did come to Greenwich, and a very small number indeed were accommodated. The liaison with the various agencies was, it wasn't perfect, and there were issues with the data that we were provided with, but that was ironed out. And the most important thing is we don't feel that anyone fell through the cracks, if you see what I mean. So we were notified in advance that a certain number of people would be wanting help from us. We were expecting those people. We were ready for those people. We had caseworkers lined up, and we were able to help where we could help. And I think a few lessons were learned for future iterations of that particular kind of programme. Generally speaking, the work with prisons we are very successful in some ways. There's a scheme called AFIO, where we've got a grant to help ex-offenders, which to some extent it's about preventing repeat criminality and so on. We've housed more people through our AFIO programme, which is grant funded, than any other London borough, and that's all into the private rented sector. So I think, though, it's one of those situations where we could always do better as a if you like, a set of agencies working with people who we know are going to be at risk of homelessness. There could be better liaison with the prisons, and there could be better liaison by us with them, I suppose. So I think you've struck upon a really key issue, because obviously people with a background of the criminal justice system are overrepresented in our rough sleeping community.
We make that as sort of a recommendation, perhaps, from the committee, that we try to increase that that liaison, try to improve that liaison.
Obviously, that's for the committee to decide. I think the general drive is to work with all agencies. So maybe what is really needed is a really strong national homelessness strategy. It's cross-department, it's cross-ministerial, and every agency where it is known that they work with a lot of people at risk of homelessness or who are homeless or who have experienced homelessness is signed up to making prevention a really important part of what they do. And that would most definitely include the prison service, the Ministry of Justice, and so on. So that may help the committee decide on potentially a recommendation. So, thank you for that. On Prime and Beam, so essentially, our role is to refer people to those organisations, and then they do the work, and they find employment. Beam, for example, helps people to find employment. They will do things such as buy suits for people who don't possess suits, so that when they go to an interview, they present really well. And Oyster cards, thank you, Pat. And they will train them in how to be interviewed, give them skills they have never been given before. So they do that side of things, and they also, that's how they started. That was the Beam model to start with. Then added to that, helping people find private rent sector accommodation as well. So where we're spending, as the paper says, so £6,363, which it doesn't say, but you divide 350, that's by 55. It's 6,363 per person who both got a job and got a home. It's incredible value. And so your point, Magello, was maybe we should invest more in that. And that's always that balancing act about the money we've got, where we put it, and so on. And we are always considering whether we should invest more in schemes like Beam, schemes like Prime. On the same sort of topic of helping people into the private rented sector, we do have our own project on that, which is about offering landlords incentives. So we will, and almost every London borough has been doing this for a very long time, we'll offer to make a payment to a landlord, in return for which the landlord takes on our homeless client as their tenant. So they're not in temporary accommodation anymore, they are in secure long-term private rent sector housing, and we no longer have a duty to provide temporary accommodation and so on. We've been doing that quite a long time. Our incentives were quite low, and early this year, as Pat will well know, the leader signed off a report which was enabling us to increase those incentives. It's still much cheaper for us to part with some money to a private sector landlord who then takes on our homeless person as their tenant than it is for us to warehouse people in temporary accommodation. And so we've increased that despite the budgetary crisis that we have. So we're forever looking to try to invest more in prevention, more in cure than in delivery of temporary accommodation, if you see what I mean. So hopefully that's of some reassurance. And I didn't write.
No, you're done. I think that was it, wasn't it, Councillor? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Thomas?
Thank you, Chair. Super quick one. I'm just thinking of us in terms of being corporate parents, and it could be that the numbers are negligible or it doesn't really matter at all. I was wondering how care leavers are faring.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. So with care leavers, obviously, yes, we are corporate parents. I'm on the Corporate Parenting Partnership Board. I run a subgroup delivering actions to do with resilience and independence, reporting into the board. And my meeting is co-chaired by a young person with lived experience. It's the most amazing thing that I do in my job. So I'm really, really signed up to this. So what we feel is that temporary accommodation is the wrong place for a child in our care or a child who's left our care. So we have supported housing, children's services, commission much of the supported housing for looked after children. We also commission some as well. So there's a pathway, effectively, so that our care leavers, our children who are looked after, don't end up in hotels. Occasionally, very occasionally, very, very rarely, a young person might fall out of the pathways, out of the supported housing they're in, which can be because despite an enormous amount of effort and patience and understanding, like a parent would have to their child, it doesn't work for them in that setting. It's causing too much upset and distress to maybe other residents and staff and so on. and they kind of can't be kept in supported accommodation anymore. Obviously, we will not see one of our children on the streets, and then the only option might be left that is temporary accommodation. And then the job is to work with that young person so they can go back into the pathway as quickly as humanly possible, if that is possible. So I don't have the numbers at my disposal, Councillor, but I can assure you, and I have looked at this very closely.
Just to add, Councillor Thomas, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but our looked after children get priority B1, should they bid. I have no clue how often they bid, how many get accommodation, but they certainly get the highest priority other than A, which you know is decants and stuff.
Councillor Asgar.
Thank you, Chair. And no offence, Sean, but I wish we didn't have this report. Wish we had no homelessness. I'm going to ask several questions, so you've got them all at once. Obviously, the biggest driver of homelessness is the end of private rented tenancies. Has any projections been done as to the effect that the Renters' Rights Bill might have? Because the Renters' Rights Bill, all things being well, will receive royal assent maybe next summer. That will mean assured periodic tenancies for all. Landlords can only put the rent up fairly once a year. People will not just get 2 months' notice from their landlord anymore. Landlord can only end a tenancy in very, very specific circumstances. Is that going to help the figures at all once that comes in your opinion? Or has any models been worked out for that? On domestic abuse survivors, do we have any sort of reciprocal arrangements with other boroughs when people need to be rehoused away from their abuser? Then I have a question on the incentives that are being offered to house people. So with friends and family being given cash incentives to put up a member of their family, how long is that for? Is it indefinitely, for as long as that they house their family member in their own home? On mediation with private landlords, again, paid incentives to take people, presumably from our housing register. How long is this incentive paid for? That does relate to the prime scheme as well. I had a gentleman in my ward who was taken off the RBG housing list because he was housed in one of these schemes in the private sector with a partner organisation. That landlord then eventually evicted him, but he could not get back on the housing list with RBG. He couldn't be rehoused because by him being dispatched to the private sector, he was off our list and had to start at the bottom again. So it seems incredibly unfair when it goes wrong. So do we have any safeguards for our residents who have been on our housing list, have been dispatched to the private sector, but what happens if it all goes wrong? Because that has happened to one of my constituents. It was very upsetting for him and actually for me to just having to deal with it as well. Can you tell me what CBL is? I don't quite know. Yeah, no, choice-based lettings, exactly. But what is it? I don't understand what that is, sorry. Okay, thank you very much. You mentioned about sometimes people on our housing list are offered social housing elsewhere in the country. Do we have an agreement with another council elsewhere in the country and that's where they go? Where do you usually send people in those cases? And on overcrowding, I was previously on the regeneration panel, and this is one for them, but I do like to see that you want to explore cross-council collaborative approach, and that was exactly my question to that panel. I said about perhaps, I know this sounds really simple, but extending our housing stock quite simply by putting a permitted development extension on the back or a permitted development loft extension could actually increase the size of our housing stock and ease overcrowding. When you have a family who have perhaps a 2-bedroom house and need a 4-bedroom house, or this can easily be done by going up into the loft or building a permitted extension on the back. That sort of thinking is the sort of thing I'd quite like to see. Has there been any sort of moves in that direction? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. So going back to the first one, the Renters' Rights Bill, that's an excellent question. I won't go into the changes that are touted by the bill, but obviously your question is about what could be the possible impacts on homelessness. And whilst, I mean, there are all positives to this, which is it won't be so easy for landlords to evict their tenants. The no-fault eviction is literally that. There does not have to be any reason at all for a landlord to issue a Section 21 notice, and there's no defence to it. So it should reduce evictions. That's inevitable, I think, and that's obviously good when it comes to homelessness. The thing that we, and it won't just be us, there'll be all sorts of consultants getting asked to look at this, and London School of Economics and all the big people will be doing research into this, Savills and whatnot. How is the market going to respond? What is landlord sentiment going to be? I think it doesn't take a housing genius, which I am not, to work out that lots of landlords will exit the market in advance of that, because the reason they're in the market is that flexibility they've got. Lots of landlords are very much not bad people, they're not bad landlords, but they just want to be able to get their home back when they want it, when they need it, or they want to get the home back to do something else with it, sell it, etc. So not being able to evict someone, or the image you won't be able to do that, and they might be wrong in some cases, that actually when you do need to do certain things with your home, you will be able to evict, but people's impressions are really important. So the market might respond in a way which means the private rented sector as is shrinks. Where do those properties end up? Airbnb, short-term lets, etc. We don't know, and there will be research going on into this. We're just about to really start looking at this properly ourselves as part of our temporary accommodation cost reduction programme, because it's obviously a risk to that programme, or it could be a benefit to the programme. It's exactly that. Which way will it go? So that's just some initial really basic thoughts.
Can I just add, Sean's right, and none of us know yet the impact. In conversation with people nationally responsible for guiding the bill through the Commons, I think they're thinking, maybe hoping, that it's the much smaller ones who will be put off by this. And I don't know how often we use people who've got 1 or 2 properties. We tend to lease, deal with quite big providers, don't we? So, but I think it is generally speculation, but there is definitely some sense that it will be the smaller ones who will peel off, which is not great, but hopefully not the big boys and girls. But nobody knows. It's true to say.
Thanks, Pat. Just to say, there's already something happening, we think. So we're still in the first paper, yeah. Sorry, right. Funny moment there. I don't think I am. In temporary accommodation world, there's a type of temporary accommodation called emergency overnight accommodation, which is basically private rented sector accommodation, but it's paid for on a nightly rate. There's a supplier, we pay the supplier, they house the homeless person, but it's temporary accommodation. And that's been shrinking massively in the last few years, in the same way that the private rented sector, in terms of affordable supply of private rented sector, has been shrinking massively. All of a sudden, it's changed. There's been this huge increase in literally the last 6 to 7 weeks, where we've gone from below 1,000, where we were stuck for months, of EOA units, which are much better and cheaper than hotels. And we're doing all sorts of things, and it was not going anywhere. It's now up to 1,060. It's going up, and I asked Vincent, who's our head of housing inclusion and support services, why might that be? And he basically said it's landlords moving their properties out of the private rented sector into temporary accommodation. That's not a good outcome. I know I just said EOA units are better than hotels, but long-term settled housing is much better than temporary accommodation, let's face it. So, that's one of the ways in which the market is already reacting, I would say. And that's a signal, not a trend yet. It's too soon to say. But I'm pretty convinced that that's one thing that people are going to do, because the Renters' Rights Bill won't cover nightly paid temporary accommodation as far as I know. As far as I know, but there's lots more research to be done.
Probably worth rattling through the many questions.
Yep. Domestic abuse survivors are the kind of reciprocal agreements with other boroughs. I think the starting point is if somebody becomes homeless due to domestic abuse, they can apply to any local authority in the country. They do not have to have a local connection with the local authority they apply to. And that's incredibly important, of course, because a lot, but not all, but a lot of domestic abuse survivors don't want to remain in their locality. So, but then you do get cases where somebody has applied to Greenwich and they realise, no, this isn't the right place for me in the long term. I do want to get away. And then it is problematic, because if they then go off and apply to Lewisham, sorry to use Lewisham, any other borough, the other borough is going to say, well, you've applied to Greenwich. And then, okay, you can have conversations, but it's not like a legally binding situation that the application with Greenwich falls away because the survivor says she doesn't want to apply with Greenwich anymore. She does want to apply with Lewisham. It's all very complicated, but beyond that, there are London-wide schemes also for helping domestic abuse survivors. There's, of course, the refuge system as a kind of safe space when you flee and you need somewhere where you can work with someone who can help you, and then you're helped to apply to the right authority and so on. And there are ways in which if a domestic abuse survivor was a council tenant and she loses that council tenancy because she has to flee it, then there are requirements that you should replace that home with a new permanent home. If she can't, but again, that's more if she applies to the same borough she was already living in. So there's some weaknesses, I would say, there. Friends and family, where we make a payment to the host, we have to be convinced that they are going to look after the person for at least 6 months. At least 6 months, okay? So it is done responsibly, and it has to be, because we do have limited funding for making those payments, but they are very successful, and often it is the case that when somebody has been able to stay with that host that they were due to be evicted by, or with a different host who they never lived with before, they can be in band B1 and can potentially be successful in bidding for social housing. Some do move into the private rented sector instead of social housing. So again, we think that's quite good value for money, and actually we received government grant money to help us get that off the ground, that particular scheme, and not many boroughs do it. So it's an example of Greenwich being quite creative. And then you said, so when we part with money to a private rented sector landlord who gives the homeless person a short tenancy, how long is that for? Minimum 12 months, fixed term, a short tenancy. And of course, usually they last an awful lot longer than 12 months. That's just like the minimum period, and they very, very usually go on to be renewed. Then what happens if so those schemes, all the schemes I'm talking about in this paper and I'm talking about tonight are not for people on the housing register, they're for homeless people, people at risk of statutory homelessness. So people can, of course, be in both situations. They were on the register, then they apply as homeless, and then they're on the register again, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, if somebody makes a new application to the housing register and they're living in a private rented sector tenancy, they will get no to low priority band C. And that is the same if we have housed somebody into the private rented sector, they will be in band C, because that is a short tenancy. It's the second most secure home you're going to get after a social housing tenancy, or maybe one at your own. So the safeguard you asked for isn't there in that way, but we do, of course, work to sustain those tenancies. That's very important. We do provide support to people we arrange to go into the private rented sector. We don't just abandon them, because that would be folly. Choice-based lettings, that's the way we let our our supply of social rented housing from ourselves, our own council stock, and from the registered providers, the housing associations. So every single time a property becomes available, we either advertise it to everyone on the housing register to bid for, and then the person in the highest band that has bid on that property and is verified as their situation being correct, then they're offered that property and they move into it. The reason it's called choice is because it's just that. We advertise all the homes that are available, and you bid on them, and you get to see to what band and what priority level that property went, and so on and so forth. So that's what choice-based lettings is.
I think it was Councillor Fletcher, you may remember this, Councillor Fahy, in contrast to what happened decades ago, actually, when people were just allocated a home. Whereas now it's a bit more, you can choose, you may not get it, but you can sort of choose from a smorgasbord, as it were.
Thank you, Pat. Can't read my writing. Oh, Bridge and Home Finder, yeah. So, Bridge Housing Solutions and Home Finder. So essentially, it is those organisations, Bridge, and the other one is Home Finder, on Part 4A. They find social housing units available in the rest of the country. We don't do it. So Bridge are constantly working with local authorities, registered providers across the entire country. Not surprisingly, they're often focusing on areas of low demand and high supply, which they still exist, but they're not quite as plentiful as they used to be. So you have authorities in the north commonly. Northwest used to be very common, where there was an awful lot of social housing lying empty and not bulging housing registers of people queuing up to have those homes. And so arrangements were made with London and the South East for people who wanted to move to that part of the country to be able to do so. So essentially Bridge are doing that. So we refer the person to Bridge. Bridge does all the work, really. It's extremely good value for people who want to make that move. Overcrowding, loft extensions, permitted extensions, and so on. It's an interesting one. There are thousands of people, Pat knows, on our housing register, as well as 2,000 households in temporary accommodation. There are thousands who are overcrowded and need a bigger home, want a bigger home, of course. And so I suppose in terms of rationing our scarce resources of capital and funding and so on, to decide either we are able to offer that to everyone or to only some people or to no one. And I think it would be quite difficult. I think in cases where there is disability, for example, somebody needs wheelchair accessible adaptations. We do that. We will do extensions and we'll make that home suitable if we possibly can through our disability home improvement service. In general, it's not potentially much of a viable solution, but
I think the only, and we've got to move on, but Chair, but I think the only thing we need to, the best way that we're currently sweating our asses, what I meant is, I don't know how many loft extensions we can ask, but you'll know, and I want you all to promote the new under occupancy scheme. So the incentives have more or less trebled. For every bedroom you give up, you get £1,000, and we'll help you with removal. And if people are above pension credit age, well, I can't remember what that is now. Is that 67?
depends when you were born.
67 for me, 66 for me. Then you can for the first time keep a spare bedroom, which often put people off from giving up 3. They had to go from 3 to 1. And so they didn't often, but they can go from 3 to 2, which is great for a carer, family member, whatever. And the other thing, final thing on that to promote is Sean appointed about a month or so ago, an officer dedicated to do this, and particularly to help older people which they'll often be, won't they? Been the family home 30 years, loads of stuff in it, like we're all probably experienced with stuff, and help them downsize, which is really important because this is daunting. So please draw attention to that. Thank you.
Councillor Tester, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. I did have a couple of questions, but a few of them have been answered by the questions that some of the other councillors answered. But I was just sort of hoping to look a little bit more into some of the prevention, particularly help to stay with family and friends and, help residents maintain or find private rented homes, which are both quite similar, and I think they're both great ideas. My first question with those is, at what point would those processes kick in? Is that when a person or a family reports as homeless, you would then start perhaps negotiating with their former landlord to try and cancel. If, for instance, somebody's in a family home or staying with a friend and they've been asked to leave, can they come and speak to the council before they've left and try and start doing something about that? And then it's kind of very similar to what Naz asked about the money. Are there any safeguards to sort of prevent the money going to people and then them asking the residents to leave shortly after?
Councillor Tester, thank you. So when does prevention kick in? I suppose one should refer back to the legislation. So the Homelessness Reduction Act 2017 sets out that there's a duty to inquire about someone's potential homelessness if it is likely that they will become homeless within the next 56 days.
56, thank
you. That's the law. We don't, if someone comes in and it's going to be 80 days, we don't say come back in 24 days at Greenwich, although that's not necessarily industry standard. So we want to intervene. We want to get involved as early as is possible. We know that's essential because it does take time to both make inquiries, which one is required to do to make sure this person is who they say they are, this family member is a genuine family member, this is the genuine housing situation, they don't have a home somewhere else that you don't know about. You have to make investigations, inquiries to make sure you're helping the right people. That takes a little bit of time. Then prevention takes time. So, as you said, liaising with family members, liaising with private rent sector landlords, it's not usually one phone call and you're done. Not surprisingly, there's a relationship to build up. You need to understand the context of what's led to the family member wanting to evict their own son, their own daughter, for example.
I'm just conscious of time, sorry.
Okay.
Does the committee finish at 8:30? Oh, it doesn't. Oh, fine. Crack on.
Thank you.
Sorry, Sean.
You've never told me
I
crack
thought
on
it did for
before.
some reason.
So the earlier we are involved, the better. If somebody comes to us and they're going to be homeless tomorrow, it almost doesn't matter what the reason is that they are becoming homeless, family, friends eviction, private rent sector landlord eviction, we're not going to be able to prevent that homelessness. So we want to know as early as possible, and all of those things kick in as early as they can. And they do run in parallel. We don't do our inquiries, satisfy ourselves that really is Roger Tester, and then start to prevent Roger's homelessness. We do it all twin track or triple track and so on and so forth. So as early as possible is the thing. And again, the money, so yes, it's after 6 months the payments are made, if you see what I mean, with the host, potential host eviction cases. So family members evicting their son or whatever, 6 months has to happen before the payment's made. The private rented sector, well, we make the payment when the tenancy has been signed by the tenant. It's a lawful tenancy at that point. The landlord cannot renege at that point, and the tenancy starts up, and then the landlord can't just summarily evict them without acting illegally. So yeah, those payments are pretty much, I would say, protected. If we saw abuse of the system, we would do something about the abuse of the system and change the system, frankly. We're definitely not about throwing public money at something in the hope it will work. It is tried and tested. And as I said, actually, really interested, that family eviction situation was government grant funded, so obviously we had to respond, we had to talk to the government about it, and they're obviously thinking about whether it's something that should be used nationally and so on. Yeah, that's it.
And I saw sort of somewhere further down in the report that the reason why it's cost effective to give payments out, and that might seem a bit counterintuitive, but I know there's a good reason why. That's because you won't then have to put them in temporary accommodation. Is that what they're saving?
Yes, and the eye-watering cost of temporary accommodation is coming up soon.
Okay.
Thank you. So we'll move on to item 7, temporary accommodation. To consider the temporary accommodation housing report and make recommendations to the executive if necessary. So it's over to you again, Sean.
Thank you, Chair. So we've talked about the prevention of homelessness and why people are at risk of homelessness, but this is about the situation where we, the council, have a duty to provide a homeless person or family with temporary accommodation. So we're talking about the financial impacts of that, the impacts on the people going through that situation, and everything that we're trying to do to mitigate against this situation. So again, I'll try not to go through all of the report, but I think the context is really, really important. There are 117,000 households in temporary accommodation nationally, which is the highest figure ever, and it's only going in one direction, sadly. Just out of interest, the last time it was anything like this high was 2003, and then that was halved by 2010, when the government of the time set a national target for halving temporary accommodation within 5 years, and it happened between 2004, in fact, and 2010. That's not happening at the moment. Quite the opposite is happening at the moment, unfortunately. There's some London figures in there, 66,200 households in temporary accommodation in London in January of this year. Then there's the cost, the eye-watering cost. So there's so many different ways of looking at this, but from September 22 to September 23, the combined monthly temporary accommodation spend of all London boroughs rose by £90.4 million. The numbers are quite eye-watering. There's a lot of them in this report. So going back historically, the scale of the issue, in 2017, there was only 392 households in TA to this borough. There was 2,000, basically, at some point in September. As I said, we are not immune from the national crisis or the London crisis. Really importantly, it isn't just a numbers game. Obviously, it's about human beings. But within that, the really important point is that at the moment, unlike in the early 2000s, the type of temporary accommodation boroughs and local authorities across the country are using is completely different. So this report will talk about hotel usage. It's almost as if it's now normal, which actually at the moment it is. In April of 2022, this borough had 0 hotel rooms booked. None, not one. As Pat mentioned earlier under paper 1, in April of this year, that was 291. So we've gone from 0 to 291 in 2 years. Nothing like it's ever happened before, and we don't think anything like it could ever possibly happen again, we hope. It has reduced, as Pat said earlier. It's more like 150, 140, and the point of this paper is to explain how that happened to some extent and what our ambitions are going forwards. But it is important to understand the finances and what does hotel rooms mean, apart from it's completely inappropriate, especially for families to live in hotel rooms. Financially, it's also ruinous. That's not a strong word, it's ruinous. So for each hotel room we've got, and this does change from time to time, but we literally lose about £70 a night for every room we've got. So that's after housing benefits subsidy has been collected by the borough, because the rooms cost 120 a night, 110 a night, 100 a night, 95 a night. Subsidy covers a pittance of that, because the subsidy arrangements for temporary accommodation are pinned at 90% of the 2011 local housing allowance rates. It's 2024. So that's for all types of TA, apart from the type of TA that we own, which we'll come back to a bit later. So hotels, that's all the person we place can claim. And we're liable, obviously, for the whole cost. And sometimes people don't claim. We do have about 1,000 units of what we call emergency overnight accommodation. So that's where there is a supplier, like a lettings agent. They're offering all sorts, lots of London boroughs available units. If we book one, then we will pay for that on a nightly basis. They manage the property, and we're responsible for paying for the property, of course, on behalf of our homeless household. And it is the second most expensive form of TA that we use. And on that, we lose about £29 a night, which is a lot less than we lose on hotels. But across 1,000 units, it's, well, millions a year. It's millions a year for hotels and millions a year for EOA at the moment. So this is all escalated, as you'll have heard. No hotels in April 2022, 291 April this year. EOA hasn't necessarily escalated in numerical terms. It has escalated massively in terms of cost. It's because it's part of the private rented sector, which is now at the most expensive it's ever been. The private rented sector, private housing, is the most costly it's ever been. And that transfers itself across to this type of accommodation, which is just a subset of the private rented sector. So we're losing loads of money on that as well. All told, we're currently forecasting an overspend a spend, let's get my terminology right, a spend of £14.39 million on hotels and emergency overnight accommodation this year. And very little of that will come back from the subsidy system, as you've heard. So, won't talk about the process too much. We place people in temporary accommodation, though, maybe it's important. Somebody has to be owed what's called, considered to have a priority need when they apply as homeless. And that means, well, if you've got children, you are in priority need. If you are an expectant mother, you are in priority need. If you are a single person, to be in priority need, you have to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is quite a high threshold. It's quite a high benchmark. So somebody with quite severe physical health conditions or quite severe mental health might be found to be in priority need. But a lot of people are not in priority need. So not everyone who's homeless does get temporary accommodation under the law. And obviously we follow the law. The process is we've got a housing inclusion service who's there to try and intercept people, as we've talked about, under prevention as early as humanly possible, prevent them becoming homeless. But if they cannot be prevented becoming homeless and there's reason to believe they've been in priority need, then we must and do provide temporary accommodation. And our policy on that is at Appendix B. So one of the questions the panel would doubtless have is, well, I think, John, you might have mentioned earlier about people living in hotels a long way away from the borough and how incredibly difficult that is. How do we decide that that is even a thing, that it's possible? And how do we decide who can live at that distance from the borough and we're not acting unlawfully? Our policy sets that out. We can explore that later on. Okay, so that's a bit of a summary of the situation, as was. Essentially, the emergency button was pushed around about September last year when we were forecasting an overspend of £13.4 million on temporary accommodation, which was, I think, bigger than the overspend that's been forecast on both health and adult social care and children's social care. That's never been the case before. I think it was the biggest overspend that ever been forecast by this borough. So a financial management board was put together, obviously chaired by Councillor Hyland, with Pat, the leader, Chief Exec, Director of Finance, myself and Jamie Carswell as the officers. So a financial management board was incepted because of the potential for this causing the council severe financial harm. Beneath the financial management board, Jamie Carswell set up a temporary accommodation cost reduction programme board in September 23. That met weekly until Christmas. It features directors from across the whole organisation. It really is cross-service, cross-departmental. It's a proper collaboration. Yeah, we met weekly and we incepted this programme, which I'll be talking about more in a minute. We're now meeting monthly, and we don't foresee a time where we won't be meeting, sadly, yet. Three main objectives to the programme, cost reduction programme. So we want to achieve a budget-neutral temporary accommodation stock profile. We want to increase the suitability of the TA we place homeless households in, eliminating use of not just hotels, but there are other types of shared facilities, temporary accommodation that we do use as well. And it's illegal to have a family in a shared facility, bed and breakfast type TA for more than 6 weeks. I have to sit here and admit to the panel that we have more than one family in that situation every night. Depends who's watching. We have a very large number of families who've been in this type of temporary accommodation for a lot longer than 6 weeks, and so do a lot of other London boroughs, sadly. And so is Leicester City Council, which is a different matter. Okay, so beneath the programme, we identified obviously lots of levers, ways in which we could achieve the ambitions that I've just set out, the objectives, including rehousing more households into settled accommodation. So I won't go through them all, but the levers I'll go through. So reduce the number of households in hotels and unsuitable TA, reduce the average unit cost across our hotel and EOA stock, and maximise the income we generate from our TA stock. So those are the levers, and there's lots of work that's gone on underneath those levers to achieve those ambitions. Yeah, whiz forward on the presumption everyone's obviously read the report. I'll go to the risk table, which is at the bottom of a page, where it says see appendix A for more detailed information. Yeah, sorry, what page is that? Sorry. Is that all right?
Someone's
okay.
Did you say the page?
Yeah. So not surprising, we have a risk log for the programme, and I won't go through them all, but the Renters' Rights Bill is actually in there, for example, so it's fairly contemporary. And obviously what we're looking at is what's the likelihood of a risk occurring, what is the impact if it does occur, and what we're doing to mitigate against it, and what could we do. So the Renters' Rights Bill is there. Other risks we face are spiralling costs of emergency overnight accommodation, where we've got, as I say, 1,000 units. So it's very sensitive. If those prices change, our financial liability escalates very quickly. I won't mention the other ones. They're there for you to read. So in terms of the resident experience, so obviously we operate this system with an incredibly heavy heart. No one came into homelessness or temporary accommodation work to be offering people travel lodge in Gillingham, saying to them that that booking will be for 7 nights. I should mention Travelodge's national terms and conditions are such that no one, be they homeless person, be they billionaire, can book one of their rooms for more than 28 nights. It's just their national terms and conditions, and they're completely immovable on that. So not only are we using hotel rooms, it isn't even as if you go to the Gillingham branch Travelodge and that's where you will be until you move to more settled accommodation. It is true, and the fact that people are being moved from one branch to another. Families are staying in our hotels on average, when they are placed in hotels, for about 19 weeks on average. In those 19 weeks, they're not going to be able to stay in the same room for those 19 weeks. That's the reality. It's absolutely appalling. And it pains my staff, believe you me. So anyway, so updates on a resident experience. I mean, I've just got to be honest about it. The resident experience is pretty dreadful. So what are we doing about it? The main thing we're doing about it is trying to get out of hotels. I mean, you can't really provide support to someone you've placed in Gillingham in a Travelodge room, and they're going to be there 7 nights. So our job is to get these dots. So there's a map showing our EOA placements and a map showing our hotel placements. So we want the hotel map to cease to have any dots on it at all by March 2026, which I'll explain how we're going to do that in a minute. And we want far fewer dots at distance from Greenwich, if we can possibly do that in our EOA supply, again, by March 2026. I think that's a good way of representing what we're trying to achieve here. So, yeah, this page here sets out almost what the offer is in Travelodge hotels. Very little. Kettles in rooms, no fridges in a lot of the rooms. It's provided where there's medical reasons you need to store your medication, or someone in their household's medication. Cots are provided, and the hotels don't provide bottle warmers generally, and branches can have different approaches to these matters as well. So you can't cook for yourself either. There's no cooking facilities in your room, and there's not communal cooking facilities either. So they are the most unsuitable form of temporary accommodation we use. There's a lot of stuff we do to try and support people, which is all listed on that page. A lot of it's about working with other agencies. But I think, the agencies will say, and do say quite rightly, to us, that it's difficult for them to support people when they're in hotels, and especially when they're moved from one room to another and feeling very insecure and feeling very unsafe, actually, and not feeling rooted at all, and not feeling helped out of their homelessness situation, which is obviously one of the most stressful things one can imagine happening in the first place, is being homeless, and the system is not helping in that way. I did want to mention some of the work we're doing. We're doing some work with an organisation called Creating Ground you may or may not have heard of. They're an organisation made from women who have fled or left their home country, sought refuge in this country, and they found each other, and they've come together to try and influence lots of policies and national systems, one of which is the homelessness system. And we're working really closely with them, and they're a brilliant mouthpiece for a particularly vulnerable cohort. And we're doing lots of work with them at the moment. And we've done practical things. We've much improved Wi-Fi access for people in our temporary accommodation by giving out free SIM cards. That was an idea born from conversations with Creating Ground. Next, we're going to be looking at storage. The ladies in Creating Ground have made it incredibly clear that storage is causing more problems than we imagined. We knew it was difficult, but they've demonstrated how difficult it is. So we're doing collaborative work, doing co-productive work, whilst at the same time trying to deal with this crisis. So I'll stop there because I think there's probably going to be a lot of questions.
It was a lot. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for your honesty as well. Really appreciated. I'll go straight to questions from councillors. Councillor Tester, any questions? No. Okay. Councillor Ashgar.
Thank you for that, Sean. It's really, really concise. I have to say, it's really great having that a depth of detail. Temporary accommodation, again, this is a bit off menu, but I have raised this before, again, on another panel I've been on, and I've raised it elsewhere in the council. We own buildings that are up for review, strategic asset review, buildings that might be on the disposal list or have been deemed, let's sell it. But bit of creative thinking in converting some of our own properties that aren't houses. We own properties that are being reviewed. What should we do with them? Converting them into temporary accommodation. That would save money, and then we have that permanent resource. Is there any sort of, I've asked this so many times and I just never get an answer on it. And I would really like to see some sort of joint working on this, because it seems to me insane that we are selling properties, or will potentially be selling properties that we own that aren't residential, that if sold will be bought by a property developer who will convert them into residential. We could be doing the same and use them as temporary accommodation. What are your thoughts on that, Sean? Thanks.
My thoughts on that are that it's a very good idea, and it's actually something we are doing. So it is something that the Department for Regeneration, Enterprise and Skills lead on. So there is a strategic asset review in place, and there's a process for the council to decide what would make best use of that asset. So maybe there's a separate request there for more information.
Yeah, Councillor Ashgar, I don't know the number. They always come to the housing department when they're planning to dispose, and we look at whether we can make use of it. Now, I don't know if that's conversions and stuff, so I don't know the deep answer to your question, but that absolutely come to us about a building they intend to dispose.
You just rang a bell that was said to me in a previous panel. We always ask housing if they want it first, but I think that's more houses, things that were already residential, but I'm just saying, thinking outside the box a bit, there could be a building that we own that you wouldn't think is residential, but a developer would, and we could be using that. That's the sort of thinking that I think myself and quite a lot of other councillors would like to see. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Councillor Allen?
Just talking about hotel accommodation, and I note, of course, that your goal is to shed that style of accommodation for temporary accommodation entirely by 26. However, it still exists. And for a family, especially with a child 12 months and under, I find it extraordinary that in the 21st century Britain, there is nowhere for that mother to heat a bottle, to put anything in a fridge, and to be guaranteed a cot. I mean, you know, we would expect this in a war zone in Gaza, but not in 21st century Britain in a hotel. Now, I understand the issues. I understand the issues with getting agreements with, for example, Travelodge. This is the situation we're in. It's appalling. But there must be a way for the council to guarantee for people who are in temporary accommodation, who have children 12 months and under, guarantee those three things: a bottle warmer, a cot, and a fridge. Now, if that means that we keep a supply of those things, a small supply, because as you say, mostly cots are available, but it has to be guaranteed. We must, and I would like this to be a recommendation, that we must have a policy as a council that when we are placing people in a hotel for temporary accommodation, emergency accommodation, that they are guaranteed, if they have a child 12 months and under, of those things. Guaranteed. Now, how it's achieved, whether we supply this, whether we organise a meeting with the chains like Travelodge that we use the most, in 21st century Britain, it cannot be that we can have children in a hotel room without possibly even a cot to sleep in.
Can I just take that? I mean, obviously, you're preaching to the converted. The cot thing, I think we can look at. Sean might have more to say. We're kind of in the hands largely of Travelodge, actually. We've been to them, haven't we? Me and Councillor Oliver went to them. They will not allow microwaves in the rooms. They will not allow fridges under exceptional circumstances, principally because of their electrical safety policies. That is that reason for them, I'm afraid. Cots, different matter. I'm sure we can do something about it, but I'm not sure what we've done.
Bottle warmers can be small, very small. Okay, you do have to plug them in. But, you know, I mean, these are sort of essentials for life. It's not... And so, you know, you're saying that Travelodge will not even allow you to supply them? What about bottle warmers?
Same. But, I mean, we can try again, but we absolutely have. We visited a family, myself and Councillor Oliver, exactly that position in Woolwich, Travelodge, about a few months ago, and picked it up, took it forward, and no. National policy for Travelodge, they will not allow those sorts of electrical goods in their bedrooms. And it is, there's no question. I don't think anybody in this room would think it's anything other than ridiculous in the 21st century. Unfortunately, it's not Sean who's doing it.
Councillor Fahy?
I can't remember if they provide a minibar in Travelodge. No. My memory escapes me in that regard. So I'm not aware of that. But it's clearly evident from the presentations you've done this evening that the present situation financially and morally is unsustainable. So it seems to me that everybody should be working collectively to reduce the obligation of having to house residents out of borough and in hotel accommodation. And so therefore I think colleagues have made a very valid point that we do have the ability, if we want to make those decisions, to use the assets at our disposal, not to sell them off to somebody else, is a first priority. Because 21st century, as Councillor Anning has said, is important, and we should have nobody either on the streets or in temporary accommodation. But it is a challenge, and I was interested in the 2026 vision, and good luck with that. The final point I wanted to make is I see on page 125, that there's been 13 judicial reviews. What do those relate to? 13 judicial reviews.
I would like to talk about March 2026, actually. So how are we going to get to 0 hotels by March 2026? I didn't mention any of that from the report, but I think it's worth verbalising that. So we are making surprisingly good progress, actually. So where we were at 291 hotel rooms in April, we're now down, I was told in a meeting earlier today, below 150. It's going down. How has that been achieved? It's all set out in the report, but it is most definitely worth talking about. So the programme has convened an enormous range of actions, some of which were things that the council most definitely would not have done were we not in this situation. So colleagues will probably, the panel will probably be aware of us acquiring 133 homes, 100 at Greenwich Village Block 203.
The page that you should go to that Sean will be talking of is 92, and it will be the levers, but the middle column, interventions.
Yeah.
I beg your pardon? Thank you. You're very welcome, Councillor Fahy. So page 92, middle column, interventions.
Yep, so they're all set out there in the report. Yeah, that's okay. So 133 homes that we acquired with a lot of grant money. Yes, there is a typo.
Shandy, yes.
Sorry about that. We are acquiring, I say we, our colleagues in Dres, and as Councillor Fahy said, this has to be a whole council approach, and this whole programme is whole council. So Dres acquired Sandy Hill Road, Dres acquired Greenwich Main Village, Block 203, and Housing Needs and Tenancy occupied it, and so on and so forth. We are acquiring a lot of properties from the open housing market. So we're buying properties from the open market and using them as temporary accommodation. We've now got about 600 such properties. So we are really influencing the market and changing our TA stock profile. We took a decision to take 50 general needs housing stock voids that would have otherwise been allocated on choice-based lettings, and we took the very difficult decision to convert them into temporary accommodation. So panel members have said we could maybe buy properties or not sell properties and turn them into temporary accommodation. We are buying a lot of properties. We're converting a fair number of properties into in-borough, really high-quality temporary accommodation. There was a programme of making, a decision was made, which the leader delegated to the Director of Housing and Safe Communities. Decision was made to make 100 direct offers of social housing, which is in fact council housing, to homeless households living in temporary accommodation in as short a time period as possible. We did that within 6 months, those 100 direct offers, and normally 100 direct offers would take in the region of about 3 years, if we even did that. And those were very targeted direct offers, targeted on people being in emergency overnight accommodation, which is very expensive, very commonly outside of the borough, and quite insecure, the longest, and we're in band B1. So there are high priority cases, living in TA for a long time, been on housing arrest for a long time as well, and we made 100 direct offers. Obviously, that helped those 100 households out of temporary accommodation into permanent housing. Quite a lot of those offers were at GMV, Block 203 and Sandy Hill Road. Not all, but quite a lot. Sorry, Greenwich Main Village, Block 203, one of the blocks we acquired. So there was a big link up between that initiative there and this initiative here. The emergency overnight accommodation units that were freed up by the household being made the direct offer moving into permanent council housing were then used to move people out of hotels. Having said that, we weren't able to do that for 35 of those 100 units because the provider took the property back because the landlord didn't want to be in that market anymore. So 65 hotel people moved out of hotels into those units. The other 35 were nonetheless temporary accommodation reduction. And that initiative saved literally millions of pounds. Okay, and there's a lot more in here. How are we going to get to naught by March 2026? We're going to acquire a lot more properties. We're going to make a lot more direct offers because it's being successful. What's really important about direct offers, though, is that it shouldn't be seen as queue jumping, and it shouldn't be seen as something that incentivizes people to become homeless in the first place. So it is a tricky balancing act to do. But we know that if we make those 505 direct offers by March 2026, which was a decision agreed by Jamie today, Jamie Carswell, and we're also going to convert some more general needs council voids into temporary accommodation, or we're planning on doing that, 100 more than has already been agreed, which is already 100, then we will be not only out of hotels by March 2026, we'll also reduce the number of households living in emergency overnight accommodation by in excess of 200. We will be going in completely opposite direction to probably every other London borough. Yeah, that's our ambition. So there's an awful lot more to it than that. It's very hard to sum up what we're doing under the programme in words. It's mostly, almost all in the report. It is a cross-council programme. We've had incredible collaboration with DRES, with digital colleagues, with welfare advice and benefits and so on and so forth. And we're looking to collaborate even more with children's services, adult services, etc., around this programme. We were forecasting £13.4 million of overspend at one point in September of 2023. The outturn was more like £8 million. This year, we could potentially have a far smaller overspend again. And the aim is by 26 to try and be budget neutral on temporary accommodation. That may not be possible, but that's our ambition. And we are heading in the right direction.
Thank you. Councillor Tester, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, I've noticed that you just mentioned acquiring more properties, and I've also noticed recently some additional budgets to acquire properties. So we're talking about acquiring properties on the open market, aren't we, to use as permanent council homes. With the sort of figures, I think there was 13 million released just a couple of weeks ago, and earlier in the year about 50 million, reading through reports I've seen. I don't know if that's a sort of approximately a right figure. Would that money not be better spent? So the properties that Councillor Asghar is mentioning that we've got around and we're about to sell, but most of which would probably be in a state of disrepair and require some, renovation and repurposing to make them into temporary accommodation. But with those sort of funds around, would we not get a lot more units from the same amount of finance by doing exactly that?
So I'll just come in. We're kind of doing both.
Right.
The main purchases, they're brand new. They were built for the private sector, so they're quite high spec. But the private, they couldn't sell them, basically. So we stepped in and bought from right to buy receipts, from help with the mayor, borrowing based on the HRA revenue from rents and so forth. And there's another tower block coming out the ground in Greenwich Millennium Village, which we are going to, I think, buy in tranches. So we're kind of doing both, actually, Councillor Tester, yeah.
So I think a lot of the schemes that are acquisitions are quite heavily grant funded, and I think the alternative that you're putting forward is a very sensible alternative proposal. Might not attract that grant. We might not get any grant from GLA, might not get any grant from the government. So where you see those eye-watering figures, they feel eye-watering, very high proportion of that money is covered by grant, or the equivalent is covered by grant. Colleagues in DRES can talk much better to this stuff than me because it's they that do the acquisitions. But I've got here something that isn't in the papers, which is basically a summary of the supply that we're getting from acquisitions. And there's various programs that we're getting government grant from. There's something called the Council House Acquisition Program.
Don't go through them all, Sean.
There's
Maybe just the bottom line.
All right.
Would that be useful?
Yeah, sure. So we're looking to acquire 359 properties, and these are funded by government grant, largely speaking. So that wouldn't cover the alternative that you're putting forward, I don't think. But Dres colleagues were obviously happy to look into options.
Because you wouldn't get the grant for it if you were not using it for that purpose.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Quick question, very, very quick. Would it be possible for the panel to visit one of the HRA accommodation before you convert it and then visit after you've converted?
When you say
you
convert...
were saying that you're going to use 50 HRA voids
Oh, I see. No, they're not
for
I think
temporary.
what we
You're going to
mean is
use them for
rather-
temporary accommodation, yeah?
Yes.
So could we visit them before?
While
do
they're
whatever?
empty.
Yeah. Oh, we'll visit
Or
them.
would you rather go and see the new accommodation?
Well, I was going to say, it'd be good if the panel see the new, and the old,
yeah.
to see what they're like.
Actually, having said that, I hope we've moved people into all the new. So
Okay.
probably can't break in.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, we'll facilitate. What would you like to see, really? The state of the condition, or...?
Yeah, well, we were going to do it with...
You were going to do a void,
we was
weren't
going
you?
to do a void before and after, but it might be good to do a temporary accommodation one before and
Yeah.
after.
Yeah, so a
if that-
visit.
if that's possible.
After Christmas.
Yeah, great. Is that all right with the panel to do that? Yeah, great. Sorry to keep you so long, and thank you for answering all the questions. It was a really interesting night. Thank you very much. Special thanks to Richard and Sean. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
You
Chair.
can go. We've just got one quick item to do, but you can start packing up. It's only a short one.
Right, thanks ever so much, Chair. Thanks, panel. Thanks a lot. Have a good evening.
Okay.
Thank you for your work.
So, item 8 is commissioning on future reports. So the panel is asked to note the work items that are scheduled to be presented to the meeting on the Housing and Neighbourhoods Scrutiny panel taking place on the 12th of December, which possibly John will be chairing. Thanks, John. Community safety initiatives, including CCTV, statutory scrutiny of the Safer Greenwich Partnership, and tenant satisfaction measures. Yep, agreed? Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry, John, please.
Just briefly, Chair, I noticed that the vacancy still exists for tenant representatives, and I think it would be extremely useful to have some tenants on the panel.
Yes, I've got a meeting, I think it's next week, with Pat and community participation on the borough-wide housing rep, and I've asked for a lease. We're going to get a leaseholder rep as well, aren't we? Hopefully, yeah. Yeah, I didn't think he got re-elected as chair, but I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah, but we're definitely going to